Bonjour, Jayak. Hello, everyone. Anijnaga, how are you? John Lau Deshnikas. My name is John Lau. And Meknik Miske. I'm Turtle Clan and I'm Pokagnik Potawatomi. I'm from the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, that nation. And I'm Anishinaabe. I'm a human being. So it's my pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you, Meg, for the honor of that introduction and for the honor of being here. Meg's been a great friend and supporter of mine and also of the Pokagon Potawatomi community, has given community members opportunities to visit the collections here at the Shingothi, trainings in archival management and collections management, and she's also been a very good friend to me. And I always love returning to Aurora to see everyone here and to see new faces too. So I'm also very honored and happy to be participating in the celebration of Fox River testimony, and to share with you some of the things that I know about the Fox River. And to think about this place, it's our homes right now. It's a place that is dear to us, but it's also for us, our homelands, and for Indigenous people, it's been our homelands for a long, long time. For some of us, our elders tell us since the beginning. Since the very beginning, these were our homelands. These are ancestral lands, and these are holy lands. And so they're very important places to us, and to all of us, I'm sure. So again, thank you for coming out tonight on this cold and wet evening so that we can gather together. So, I do teach at Ohio State. All my classes, been there 6 years. Last year I got tenure. And so that's semi-job security. And with tenure came an office with a window. And so it's a pretty exciting time for me. But I have been teaching essentially the same class periods, different classes, but same class periods. They run on 80 minutes all the time. And so I have a body clock now of 80 minutes. But the good news is, you know, I was an adjunct for several years at University of Illinois, Chicago, and that was a 3-hour class. So I'm just saying, you know, it's getting, so if it gets to be about, 9-ish or so, and I see that the room's empty, I'll figure out that it's time to wrap it up. So anyway, no, I'll try to keep it. Well, it's a contradiction, isn't it? You try to keep an Indian brief. That's and on my dad's side was Irish, so that's no help either, right? So anyway, so great to be here. This is a painting of an understanding of our creation stories, but it's also basically, it's an understanding of our land and that we exist on the back of a turtle, right? And that's why we call this place Turtle Island. And the creation story takes about 3 hours to tell in a good way, so I'll have to save that for a couple of more trips back. Wanted to just mention, and I'll try to not have a lot of text in this PowerPoint. Whenever I do that in class, I see my students laying their heads down on the table. So, or they start taking notes with imaginary pens on imaginary paper, and which makes me feel like an imaginary teacher. So But this is a place where indigenous peoples have been for a long time. 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 40,000 years. And again, we have stories that tell us. My grandmother took me to a place on the St. Joseph River near Mishawaka, Indiana, where she said that the creator, Kasham the Doe, created woman first and then man. Woman from his breath. And then when she became lonely and bored, you know the rest of the story, right? She asked for a partner, and so man came down and insisted that he be lowered through a hole in the sky in all his glory. Talk about red flags, right? But my grandmother took me to that place in Grandma Goldie, and so that's been important to me. That this is the place of where we have always been. We say that we walk on the bones of our ancestors, and we say that with pride, that we have been here so long that you can't take a step without walking on the steps of our ancestors. And so,
Professor?
Yes?
I have a little hard time hearing you over in this section over here.
Okay.
You don't need to use the mic, just maybe speak a little louder.
Okay, I'll try to project a little better.
Thank you, bud.
Sure.
I don't want to miss a word you say.
Oh, once I keep talking, you'll wish you had missed a few words. But thank you. And anyone else have trouble? I always hate that in a class that I'm teaching when they write at the end of the semester evaluations, I didn't hear a word he said. I find that a little suspicious. I don't think they were really trying. But anyway, to get to the point, as many of you know, and I can remind some of you and maybe elaborate with some of you, that this was known as the Everglades of the North up here. The Kankakee Marsh in Indiana and the wetlands that spread through this area. And it was, so what did the impact of that have on the people and the other beings, right? Well, a lot. It affected places for agriculture, affected places, the species of hunting. It affected where you would live, certain dry spots. One of the big impacts, though, was that it affected transportation. And so with the wetlands, native peoples from this area were very close to the lower edge of the growing area for birch trees, wigwas. And so with birch bark canoes, they're very light, a very shallow draft. And so they can go through wetlands, quite, marshy areas quite nicely. And so we think of, we see the farmlands now that are pretty dry, drained, dredged. And we think of this as solid land, and we think of the rivers as well-defined. But that was not how it was in the old days. And so it made the transportation of trade, people, and ideas much easier. We're also at a place that has a geographic value to it that is really priceless. It's a vast system of waterways, and essentially it allows, you can go with a short portage from the Des Plaines River to what's the other river here? Guess I can look here. To the Des Plaines, the Chicago to the Des Plaines, that's right. From the Chicago to the Des Plaines, about a mile, you can go connect up the Mississippi River water system with the Great Lakes water system. And so you can essentially travel from the Atlantic Ocean, St. Lawrence River, to around the Great Lakes, to Chicago, down from Chicago down to the Illinois River, down the Fox River, the Illinois River to Mississippi. You can go north into what's now called Minnesota. You can go south and then head up the Missouri and go to the Rocky Mountains, or you can continue south to the Gulf of Mexico. So this was a really important place. This was an epicenter of trade and migration and peoples crisscrossing back and forth. So it was an exciting place, a cosmopolitan place to be. And so even in, I found this on the internet, advertised as the Illinois waterway, the waterway to the rest of the world. My people thought that too. Indigenous people thought of that too. You know, we were well aware of the value of that, of the importance of that, and that's why we settled here. That's why the Creator placed us here. We're also, I know that in school I would hear a lot about the Continental Divides, sort of the west in the Rocky Mountains and in the east along the Appalachians. I don't know why, but I don't remember hearing much about the continental divides between north and south, right? But it runs right through this area. Right there. And what does that mean? It means, as many of you remember from 5th grade, right, that water on one side of the Continental Divide flows one way, and on the other side of the divide flows the other way. So we're at the exact spot where native peoples and later settlers would have the choice of, if you go a little north, the water stream, the current is all running to the north, or if you want to head south, you don't have far to go, and you can find waterways that are headed south. So you can always go with the current, which makes life very easy, right? Makes life very good. So again, it's a really unique and exciting place to be. So, as these wetlands were dredged and as European settlers came, they didn't come for wetlands, right? They didn't come for swamps. They weren't as interested in the water transportation, although that was important. You know, there were canals dug and there were other things done. Transportation was, I don't want to minimize it completely, but farmland, agricultural land was the prize. And so these colonial settlers, I've gotten sort of tired. Last year I started telling my students that I'm getting tired of calling people that came over here white people. That always sounds really kind of weird. Or settlers, or colonists, or Europeans, or Euro-Americans, or, you know, so I came up with PEDs, people of European descent. So, PEDs, which most people can get with pretty good. And so I can just say PEDs, and I'll just say PEDs from now on. But as an aside, that makes the Mayflower what? The Mayflower would be the first PEDs dispenser. Right? Well, in a 15-week semester, that's the high point of the class. So, and you got it in the first 15 minutes. So, and you didn't even have to enroll. So, congratulations. Gives an idea of the map on the left. The blue areas are 40 to 80% counties that are 40 to 80% wetlands before the PEDs come. And on the right are the counties. There's no blue, right? There's very little wetlands left, and so it's a drying up of the homelands. So this is the Elbert Scharf map, which, so indigenous peoples have been here a long time, and I don't have the benefit of living here actually. So I just, for the rest of the talk, wanted to give you some contours about the indigenous peoples that were living here, the native testimony about the Fox River Valley. The Elbert Scharf map is a pretty famous map. He took the time to identify settlements in Chicago that were pre-contact and did a very nice job. I think you can see it if I go, oh, right here, there's a lizard mound. And that lizard mound isn't there anymore. It's been replaced with Wrigley Field. Who knew? Which I'm assuming that's where Pitcher's Mound comes from. I should also note, in all fair, I grew up a Cubs fan. It's the only TV we could get across the Lake Michigan. It was Channel 9 growing up, so I'm a Cubs fan. There are mounds near here. You may be aware of some closer than this one. This is up by Wheaton, which is about how far from here? 10 miles? 10, 15 miles. Yeah, I thought it was pretty close. So Winfield Mounds. So there were ancestral peoples, Adena, Hopewell, Mississippian, Fort Ancient peoples that were up here. And there's mounds. Many of those mounds have been lost. You know, they've been flattened, plowed over. So it is, and these were actually excavated and then, the space has been preserved. Are there, anyone know of any mounds closer than the Winfield Mounds to Aurora? That's about as close?
There are effigy mounds right across the river
Ah, okay.
in downtown Aurora.
Okay, very good. They have a name?
No.
Okay. We'll just call them the Aurora Effigy Mounds. There we go.
There used to be Bald Mound west of town, but it was taken down. They ruined that.
Okay. So, this gives you an idea of all the people that were calling this area home. That would have been a lot for Meg to go through that whole list. And it would have taken the wind out of this slide for me for her to do that too. So I'm glad she didn't. And not all of these people were permanent residents here, but they were traveling through or living sometimes, or movement in and movement out. Again, this was a very cosmopolitan area. And we also need to understand that most of these people are Algonquin people, except for the Ho-Chunk, the Winnebago, that are Siouan, or related to the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples. Other than them, everybody else is Algonquin, which means that we spoke similar languages, had similar spirituality, similar clan systems, similar worldviews, and so our ideas of village connections and national identity were different from Europeans. Our clan affiliation was much more important to us as sort of a social structure and a social web. So for instance, I'm Turtle Clan Potawatomi. My affinity, my rights, responsibilities, obligations to a Turtle Clan Miami person or a Turtle Clan Menominee person would be stronger than to a Bear Clan Potawatomi person. So the benefit of that is that these peoples end up being all interconnected together, right? Intermarrying with each other, reduces conflict. A couple of things that generally sort of Anthropology 101 or Sociology 101 says is that there's not a lot of conflict where there's a lot of resources. The second thing is where there's a lot of social interconnections, there's less conflict. And fortunately for this area, we had both. right? So that there was very little conflict going on. And so, am I hearing voices in my head again, or? The doctor said the medication would take care of that. But anyway, but a lot of people, and so they would not have necessarily thought of themselves until Europeans got here, until the Peds got here. And the Peds wanted to trade with people in a form and structure, social structure, governmental structure, political structure, social structure that Europeans and later Americans understood. So they wanted a national identity. And so as the balance of powers tipped in favor of the Peds, Indians, to continue the relationships, to continue the accommodations, develop these national identities. So in some sense, while these lists are important, it was really, we have to divide up each one of those into about 24 clans and then connect all the threads between those, between each. And so we would have quite a fascinating piece of social fabric. So, 1703 French engraving showing clans that the French people were coming upon. And the title of this engraving is Illinois Indians Visiting New Orleans. That's 1735. So thinking about how, wow, they were that curious to travel down to New Orleans, down the Mississippi River, those waterways that I talked about a few minutes ago. And not only curious enough, smart enough, courageous enough to do so, they wanted to find out, I suspect, what's going on down there, right? New people have moved into the neighborhood, and we want to find out what they're all about. And so, this is at the Chicago Portage National Historic Site. Has anyone been there? Yeah. It's a nice place. It's at that place that I talked about, the Portage, between the Chicago River and the Des Plaines River. And again, to connect the Fox River, if you just go a little further west, you can avoid all of that hassle by just going onto the Fox River. But, so, kind of a mid-century modern, I would say, interpretation of Father Marquette and Joliet coming. In some ways, I like this statue. The site is very nice. I think it's really, I was inspired and gladdened when I came to Chicago and was introduced to this site. That was when I was at University of Chicago, to drop names. But that came to this, but then it started to bother me. Can you imagine why it would bother me as a native person? Well, what's going on? Art statues, they have a text and they have a subtext, right? The text is heroic explorers, right? What's the subtext?
The Indians are doing all the work.
Yeah, the Indians are doing all the work. Very good. Indians are doing all the work. We've got identified Europeans, Peds, Marquette and Joliet, and two, unfortunately, anonymous Indian people that are doing all the work, right?
Sir,
Yes?
there's only 3 people there, and only one of them is an Indian, the other one's Joliet.
Oh, I thought there were 4. I thought there was a 4th one. Thank you for pointing out. That's my memory of the statue. I actually wasn't looking at the picture. So it's the one Indian's dragging the canoe. So anyway, I like it in some ways. I just think that it'd be nice to know, to have the Indian maybe perhaps positioned in a different way would provide a more interesting narrative to it. But maybe I'm too sensitive.
The sculptor was Catholic.
He was Catholic?
Yes.
Well, that's no excuse, because I'm Catholic too. So I will give him no slack for that. But then I grew up 5 miles north of Notre Dame, and I give them no slack either. So this just talks about the Chicago Portage, and it commemorates that site. And and basically this text just says what I've already told you, that it was possible to go from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains to Minnesota down to the Gulf of Mexico, all in this area. And so other peoples of this area, I would be remiss not to mention JeanBaptiste Du Sable, who I had a professor that used to say, well, how did she put it? The first white man to settle Chicago was black. Which I thought was kind of cool. Although, again, with my hypersensitivity, I started thinking, well, actually, we were here before him, so anyway, but it is kind of neat, right? To turn that sort of that tale of founding of great cities on its head. But as I note here, the way Du Sable succeeded was by marrying a daughter of a local Potawatomi chief, right? And that was very common for traders to do that, to embed themselves within the community, particularly the French traders. And so he was at the, this mouth of the Chicago River had been set aside by the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, a 6 square mile area at the mouth of the Chicago River that was set aside for the creation of a fort. And so I suspect that the Indians would have considered Du Sable Potawatomi. I suspect that he became embedded in that community to that extent. Adoption was a common practice among Algonquin Indians. And so he left under very odd circumstances for St. Louis, sort of in the middle of the night kind of thing. And so there's stories told about how, what was it, John Kinsey, basically threatened his life, told him, you either leave or I kill you. And so he left. So that was, there's Indians in this region, there's traders in this region, then the military is going to move into this region. And then it becomes a process of treaties. And treaties start out first, they're agreements between sovereign nations, government to government agreements. And they oftentimes start off, certainly in the North American experience, as agreements of peace and alliance and trade. And those were all good things for everybody involved. But later on, certainly by the early 1800s and by this period, that the treaties were becoming treaties of taking, treaties of land cession, and treaties of loss, and treaties of despair. And so I have students on occasion say, well, Professor Lau, if the Indians didn't want to participate in a treaty, why didn't they just say we don't care to come? And if only life were so easy, right? Because generally what the natives were told was that, well, we've been advised to hold a treaty council at this day and time this year, September in 1833, for instance, in Chicago. And we're going to enter into a treaty with whoever shows up. And we might do a little scrumming and scrounging around if nobody shows up until we can find somebody that'll show up. And sooner or later, either by gifts, by whiskey, by adulation, by ego, we'll get somebody to sign the treaty. Someone will be signing these treaties, and then you all will have to go. Congress has made that very clear with the 1830 Indian Removal Act. Indians east of the Mississippi are expected to get moved west of the Mississippi. One of the great ethnic cleansings in world history, right? As a part of our historical narrative of this nation. So, the chiefs would come to these treaty negotiations. And in fact, has anyone seen Equibet? Yes, and I met the folks. Ray Doherty was a tribal member, like a second mother to me, and she worked with the artist about this and was there at the dedication ceremonies where they laid down tobacco and prayed for this statue. This replaced a previous statue that had been ruined or decayed or whatever. Anyway, she told me about her conversations with the artist, that I met the artist a couple of decades later, and he denied that she told me the truth. But I don't know if jump ahead here a little bit. This is the patriarch of my tribe, Leopold Pokagon. And Ray Doherty said that Equibet is modeled after Leopold Pokagon. And there's not really any other Potawatomi chief that looks like that. So, but there may have been issues because during the dedication, Ray told me, well, I explained, he never asked us, but I explained to the artist at the dedication that, well, he's facing the wrong direction. And the artist is very upset about this, apparently. Which, is a pretty big statue to turn around. But he should be looking east. He looks west. And carries, again, remember how I talked about text and subtext? And of monuments and statues. And so the text is, great Indian leader, sort of watching over his people, right? And if he's looking west, it means that his people have gone west. Well, but we didn't go west. We stayed. So he needs to be looking east if he's going to be looking over us. And also, the tradition is that you look east anyway because that's where the day begins, that's when the sun rises, that's the happy time. When you look west, it's usually that's the end of life, the end of the journey, end of the day. And so that's why our homes, usually the doors face east, all those sorts of things. So, but in that 1833 treaty, and why I'm here, is that in 1833, the treaty commissioners conveyed to the local Indians, they were jumbled up and intertwined clans, so they called them the United Potawatomi Ojibwe and Odawa tribes, but essentially they were Potawatomi. So the Potawatomi were all called to Chicago to sign the last treaty, the last little spit of land. This section right here, the 48, section 48. And so, of course, the whiskey barrels were brought, the gifts were brought, the peace medals were brought, the offers of land to chiefs on the side, those deeds were brought. And so after much negotiation, the treaty was signed, and many of the Potawatomi then returned home. They either returned home to Illinois or to Indiana, or they fled up to Wisconsin, or they fled to Canada if they knew what was going to happen next. But Leopold Pokagon negotiated a deal the next day, an exception for the Catholic Potawatomi. And in fact, that's why Notre Dame is there. Notre Dame is there, not as a football mega power, right? It first was there to educate young Potawatomi men to become priests. So, and they had promised us when we gave them the land for the church that they would give us a free education, or so my grandma says. But none of the administration at Notre Dame says that. So, anyway, so he negotiated a deal where we would not be removed. So we were one of the few tribes east of the Mississippi that were not removed. By 1838, 5 years later, the rest of the Potawatomi in Indiana, Illinois, lower Wisconsin that could be rounded up were rounded up and sent west on a trail of death. So, fortunately, I'm a descendant then of a guy that was a shrewd negotiator. So, there's other great leaders. Blackhawk was a Meskwaki. Of course, that was involved in the Black Hawk War of 1832, which sort of prompted that treaty of 1833. The Peds decided there's no way that Indians are going to be allowed to stay here, and we don't care whether they call themselves Meskwaki or Fox or Potawatomi or whatever. They've all got to go. And so, and there was Alexander Robinson, and Keokuk, who was an adversary to Blackhawk. Keokuk was more conciliatory and more an assimilationist. Doesn't look like it the way he's dressed there, but he was more of an assimilationist. And Wabansi. And so, on Main-Poc, Saguenash, Wilmette. I just don't really have enough time to give the histories for all of them, but just suffice to say then that you won't be tested on this. But also that I wanted to convey that there were a lot of important leaders, Potawatomi and other tribal leaders in this area not that long ago. So, 200 years ago. So, and I, by the way, I wonder what this bag is. Oh, I wonder what this book is. Oh, this is a book I wrote. Who knew? Why, thank you, Meg. Thank you for setting this up here. I'm embarrassed. But it's imprints, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians in the city of Chicago. And it tells about our involvement in Northeastern Illinois. I suppose I could have, maybe for an audience here, I should have titled it Pokagon Band in the Fox River Valley, but Chicago. I should say this is what got me tenure. This is what got me that window in my office. And I make about 10 cents per copy sold. And the price is dropping like a rock on Amazon. So you better get it before it's out of print. I also am proud to say that our tribal director of education who is not a relative of mine. I have only met him once, don't know him very well at all. He ordered the tribe buy a copy of that for every household, every Potawatomi household, which is about 1,000 households, which made me for one day the #1 Indigenous bookseller on Amazon. Thank you, thank you. May not be very good at PowerPoints, but I can huckster a book. So again, this was to give you an idea of this is land that was claimed by us. This is our golden age sort of expansion of trade. We weren't impoverished by PED settlement at first. We were, in fact, enriched by it and very happy to participate in it. And particularly as we drove the Iroquois out after the Beaver Wars out of the Great Lakes region, we expanded. This was not exclusive territory. This would have been territory that other peoples were living in and using and sharing with each other. But we, Door County down to halfway down Illinois, across this region, up into Michigan, over to Detroit, and even down to the Maumee River Valley of Ohio. So we're the tribe that signed the most treaties of any tribe in the United States. And you used to hear sort of smirks about how, well, those Potawatomi, they would sign away anything, or anybody's land, theirs or somebody else's, for a glass of whiskey. This is kind of what I would get. And but I sort of figured out that, at some point, I think I was in high school, I was looking at a similar map, and I was like, I suspect the reason why we signed so many treaties is that we held at least a shared claim to some of the most resource-rich land in North America, right? So that's why we signed so many treaties. So I like the spin of that a lot better. So that's what I tell my classes. So that's again, Canoes in Chicago. I've told you about Leopold Pokagon. I actually had a professor at, again, University of Chicago, who thought that I looked a little bit like Leopold. And I just, thought to myself, Terry, you need a new pair of glasses, But, so, that was Leopold's son, Simon. I don't have proof that Simon ever spoke in Aurora, but he may have, because wherever there was an audience and a podium and a spotlight, he was there, and the tradition continues. He was a very big, popular speaker. He wrote this birch bark booklet that Indians were excluded from the 1893 Columbian Exposition. So he, in protest, had this published, and he sold it on the Midway there until he embarrassed the Columbian Exposition Board enough that they invited him to speak. He kept selling the booklet, but he did speak. And so he mentioned in this booklet that, this is a quote, I'll just sum it up, is essentially that why should we be celebrating about all we've lost while you're celebrating all you've accomplished? It's tough, right? It's tough. So if we're not clicking our heels, I hope you understand, right? That's basically what he's saying. So, but this is a picture that they had these booklets of photographs of the Columbian Exposition for sale. And so I happened to buy one and found a picture of, there's Simon on Chicago Day. He was the keynote speaker. The day was dedicated to him. He rode on a float. He was the honorary umpire for a lacrosse game. And he spoke before 70,000 people. And every time I get ready to speak in front of a new audience and I say, wow, there might be 75 people in there. That's kind of scary. Wow. And then I think, well, Simon did it for 70,000. I think so I just ask my ancestors to allow me the chance to say something that means something to someone. So he was an honored guest, wrote the second book ever written by a native person. The first was Jane Schoolcraft. He was the second. He wrote Queen of the Woods, which is semi-autobiographical. And so what I also like is that, he doesn't play Indian in the sense of, like the other, John Fox is I think he's a Ho-Chunk, a person from Wisconsin, dressed up in sort of traditional regalia, right? Simon Pokagon is dressed up like a traditional Ped of 1890, right? And he continues that. He's just like, they showed me how to use the little laser light, and I'm getting too crazy with it. But he wrote. Sometimes he was also very careful about his audience. Sometimes he'd talk about how Indians needed to quit being so Indian. Sometimes he'd lament about the Indians as a vanishing race. That was to a certain type of audience, right? To other audiences, he'd talk about the needs and the rights of Indian peoples and the obligations for the United States government to abide by its treaty promises and agreements. That was another audience, right? So, but he could read his audience pretty well. So he started the idea of a claim for the Chicago lakefront, which resulted in a lawsuit that essentially the argument was that the 1833 Treaty of Chicago and the other treaties before that had all used the lakeshore as the boundary for the northeast corner. And so those were in the 1820s and 1830s. In 1871, with the Great Fire of Chicago, all the rubbish and refuse, those sorts of things, were dumped into the lake, right, to clear the land. And it extended the lakefront out quite a ways. Michigan Avenue used to be it was the original Lakeshore Drive. The water pump, the reason the water pump is where it's at is because it used to be at the shoreline. So the whole idea of Lincoln Park, Jackson Park, Grant Park, the museum campus, Streeterville, the Gold Coast, all those places is on fill. And so the Potawatomi came up with the idea that, well, we never ceded you the lake, so if you filled in the lake and built on it, thank you. Thank you very much. And so we'd like the keys, please. But George Streeter he was also a Yankee Michigan entrepreneur who made a similar claim. But he flipped it. Instead of the Indians claiming we never gave away the land, we have an indigenous right to this land as the original peoples, he argued that fill was undiscovered land. And he ran his little sinking, leaking boat onto it and ran on shore and quickly planted a flag on it and claimed it the District of Lake Michigan and declared himself governor. This was our, Michael Williams was our secretary when we sued. He also sued for it. And I'll go back just for a second. Anyway, George Streeter divided it up into lots. And it took 50 years to finally get him moved off. And in the meantime, he was selling the lots for some of them in one day he made $50,000. And this is in like 1915. And it was right in front of Marshall Field's, the Potter Palmer's mansion this area here. So that's one of the reasons why a committee came up with the idea of Lakeshore Drive, was to sort of, let's keep the locals off the waterfront. And I'll close with this, was Leroy Smith, who was after World War II. Potawatomi people and other Indian peoples have always been a part of Chicago, have always been a part of Northeastern Illinois, and have always been a part in some way, I'm sure, of the Fox River Valley, right? And Leroy Smith represents a good representative of that. He grew up in Hartford, Michigan, a small town. After World War II, he moved to Chicago to become a trucker. He stayed involved in both communities. He was a member of the Chicago American Indian Center, but also on tribal council back home in Michigan. That's his family there. And he developed a club that in the 1970s was one of the most popular activities that the Chicago American Indian Center did, and it was the Chicago Canoe Club. And so they would go around lakes. I'm sure they were on the Fox River. I'm sure they were on the Des Plaines. They were on the Kankakee. They actually went around Manhattan Island. They set a canoeing speed record across Lake Michigan from New Buffalo to Evanston. And I had a chance to talk with one of the members. This is where they're paddling down the Illinois River. And I talked with one of the members, and he said, you know, these boats, the reason why they got these boats, Leroy worked at a fiberglass fabrication plant in Chicago. And the owner happened to be a reenactor of French voyageurs. Well, and Leroy said, well, you know, that's just sort of a modification of our traditional canoes. And if we could make canoes out of fiberglass, we could make enough of them for the whole community, right? Rather than, you know, there's no way we can make enough real birch bark canoes. So the owner, Ralph Fries, who had the Chicago canoe livery, agreed to that. He also owned the Fiberglass Fabricating company. So they started fabricating all of these canoes. And so it was quite wonderful. And Louis Traverso is the young man I talked to, who talked about, you know, we used to come to these canoe outings. We'd have that fiberglass canoe on top of the whatever truck or car or whatever we were driving. We had these really cool silk black jackets with Chicago Canoe Club on the back. We just all started growing our hair long. We had thick black hair, so we were putting it in braids for the first time in our lives. And the girls went crazy. And I said, so that's your best memory? And he said, well, yeah, you got to understand, fiberglass is really heavy and the boats were really slow. But the girls. So here's in 2010, they did an honor dance. That was our Matthew Weesaw is in the middle there, is still our chairperson for our tribe, Pokagon Potawatomi. That's Joe Poladzek, who used to be the director of the Chicago Indian Center. He's still the director of the Trickster Gallery in Schaumburg. And they were presenting a Pokagon tribal flag, and they did an honor dance for Leroy Weesaw to honor him. He, of course, he had walked on quite a while, in the early 80s, I think. So anyway, oh, there goes my animation. That's been my pleasure. And just want to say that, again, you know, the Fox River Valley, Northeastern Illinois, this region, this area, it continues to be a place that we hold close in Pokagon, Potawatomi, Anishinaabe hearts, our Dwagon, our heart. And so, again, thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you for listening to me and allowing me to share with you.